Started now, so we'd like to welcome our distinguished panel of experts. We're very pleased to have Undersecretary Dorr join us from USDA, and Jim Hettenhouse, who wrote the report we're releasing today, and Rick Tolman from the National Corn Growers, and Bob McGrath from the Young Farmers of Imperial, Nebraska. Just to provide a little background first, I'd like to make some brief remarks, and then we'll go to Undersecretary Dorr. We're here today to talk about the sustainable production of agriculture biomass for biorefinery feedstock. If you noticed in the report, in the introduction, the first sentence says, "Can American farmers feed the world and produce large supplies of biomass for a growing biorefinery industry?" The answer is yes. And that's what we really want to talk about today. I'm Brent Erickson, the Executive Vice President at the Biotechnology Industry Organization. And we're going to talk about ethanol and the emerging bio-based economy. To give some context about what we mean about a bio-based economy, we are define it as an economy where the basic building blocks for industry and the raw materials for energy are derived from plant crop-based renewable sources and are produced using industrial biotechnology. And biofuels is part of this emerging bio-based economy. You probably all remember from your school days talks about George Washington Carver, who envisioned us making all of our consumer products and industrial products using agriculture feedstocks as the starting point. And if he had been alive today, he would see that we are beginning to realize his dream of doing that because of the advances in ag biotech and industrial biotech. And indeed, industrial biotech is a key enabling technology for biofuel development and the development of a bio-based economy. And it's really about our ability to cut and paste genes and microbes that's fueling a revolution in industrial biotech. Our companies go out into nature and they find microbes that can produce enzymes, and then they use these enzymes in biofuels production and in other ways. This is actually a picture of a cellulose enzyme that's converting cellulose in plant matter to sugars that are then fermentable to ethanol. And this technology is disruptive in a sense because it's changing the paradigms and the way we make fuels and other bio-based products. Our companies are developing enzymes and microbes for all types of ethanol production. They're producing enzymes for conventional ethanol production, and another example is the Novozymes working with brewing for a no-cook ethanol production process. They're looking at how to use enzymes to convert DDGs to ethanol and making ethanol from cellulose. So part of what we're seeing evolve now is biorefinery concepts. And starch to ethanol plants are, in a sense, biorefinery concepts. Just like oil refineries, we're starting to use agriculture feedstocks to make many products. And I think it's instructive to look at the history of the oil refining industry as we review biofuels development. It was in 1853 that we distilled the first kerosene from crude oil. So it's been 153 years that petroleum refineries have evolved. We didn't get to where we are today instantly. This was a long evolution of technological advances. And I think we're going to see the same thing with biorefineries and biofuels production. As we move along, the processes will become more complex. We'll apply new technology. They'll become more efficient, and we'll make multiple products. Till we get to the point where a modern biorefinery will bring in the whole corn plant, for instance, and create ethanol, bio-based plastics, and renewable chemicals, all at the same facility. And there are key elements for ethanol production, which are adequate feedstock supply, technology for processing, and consumer demand. And we're seeing all those things line up today. I'm sure if you've been following the news reports of development in biofuels, we're seeing an explosion in biofuels development. We're even seeing oil companies move into this. We just had Chevron and BP join bio. and Shell has invested in this. And I think that's indicative of what's happening, and that people see that biofuels are real, and it's also a way to address climate change. So really, if you think about it, 2006, and I think in 2007 as well, we're seeing a perfect storm for biofuels, where there's a lack of energy security, there's economic pressure and market pull for biofuels. Congress and the administration has produced enabling policy, and the technologies are market ready to produce them, and that's increasing demand for biofuels worldwide. So when will it happen? We're producing a pretty good amount of ethanol right now. Rick will talk to this probably about how many gallons we can produce by 2015, but it's going to be significantly more. We had an announcement yesterday by Broin that they're building a plant to make ethanol from cellulose in Iowa. Abengoa is building a plant in Spain, and I think more announcements are to come. So why did we do the report? Well, we believe there's an ongoing debate about how much biofuel we can produce in America, and I think we can produce a much more significant amount than we are today. There are concerns about food and fuel, which we think we can address. And we felt like we need to frame the issues around cellulosic biomass production. And we need to think about next policy steps to produce more biofuels. David Rajewski wrote an article not too long ago in the Environmental Law Institute Journal, and he said, when talking about industrial biotechnology, instead of trying to prevent the future we don't want, we should plan to create the future we do want. And I think that's what everybody at this table wants to do today. So I'd like to go next to Undersecretary Dorr, and I guess I'll be the, I'll try to be the AV technician here. Kimberly, do you want to come up and do this for me? Thank you. No, Secretary Dorr. Oh, no. You don't have one? No. Okay.
Thank you, Brett. It is a pleasure to be here. Along with the members of the panel, there's a lot of insight to be had here from the associates on this panel. Cellulosic ethanol is a historic opportunity in our view for our nation and for rural America. It's obviously been a very high priority for President Bush and this administration, and it is, in fact, a pillar of the President's Advanced Energy Initiative. It's also a key objective for USDA, and it's a very key objective for Secretary Johans. I think it's important to note that he established about a year ago the USDA Energy Council, which I chair, to focus the efforts of the entire department on renewable energy as well as energy efficiency. USDA Rural Development, the NRCS, Ag Research Service, CREES, are all actively involved in the cellulosic research effort, and I emphasize, we collaborate closely with the Department of Energy to coordinate our efforts in this area, and I think this is very unique. This is something that we've been doing now aggressively for the last several years. I think it's important to point out that this collaboration also resulted in a energy conference over a month ago at which not just the President, but three cabinet level secretaries attended as well, Secretary Johans, Bodman, and Johnson, and I think that's indicative of this collaboration. In my view, we're actually at a critical moment, and I'm not going to count the proverbial chickens before they hatch, but after years of research, we now appear to be approaching the commercialization of cellulosic ethanol. We're not there yet, but several promising demonstrations are moving forward, such as the announcement from Broin yesterday. And I'm sure that all of us here understand the enormous potential. And if you don't, I hope when we get done today that you do. And I hope that you also share our hope and our anticipation that we will cross this commercialization threshold sooner rather than later. It is therefore time to consider some next steps. There's an old saying about military affairs that amateurs study strategy and professionals study logistics. and probably doesn't do justice to the strategists involved in this industry, but it does make the point that you can't just push a pencil across a map without knowing where you're going and how you're going to feed the troops and how you're going to move them. We're at a similar point in thinking about cellulosic ethanol. A 60 billion gallon per year ethanol industry would displace something in the neighborhood of 30% of our current gasoline usage. It would be the biggest new market opportunity for American agriculture in history. And that's significant because it has a significant opportunity for investment, for jobs, for economic growth and wealth creation throughout all of rural America. But we just can't push a pencil across the map without knowing how we're going to gather, transport, and store biomass in massive quantities. And this will involve the build-out of a very large new infrastructure. And let me emphasize that again. This will involve the build-out of a very large new infrastructure around this new industry. It will involve trucking, railroads, pipelines, staging areas, and production facilities. It's going to affect farming methods across the board. It will involve environmental permitting and rights-of-way issues, regulatory policy, and tax policy. And it is time, in my view, that we begin to address these questions. So, in fact, 2 years ago, in September of 2004, USDA Rural Development entered into a partnership with the Imperial Young Farmers and Ranchers in Nebraska to begin assessing some of these questions. And that project is ongoing and is, in fact, yielding very valuable information about sustainable agricultural practices and logistical requirements as they relate to harvesting cellulosic biomass. The bio-study being released today is a further technical elaboration of this assessment effort, and I think it's a very valuable contribution. I'm sure, however, that we will be revisiting many of these issues many times in the years to come, because the technology is, in fact, moving very, very fast, and I think sometimes this is hard for us to appreciate. We will see bioengineered improvements in feedstocks and enzymes. We will probably see the emergence of new families of feedstocks that we do not now anticipate. And we will see an evolution of farming methods and equipment, and this is going to impact every part of this, which is a very complex system. These, however, in my view, are not problems, and I emphasize this as well. They are, in fact, huge opportunities. Opportunities for research and innovation, for higher returns to producers, for investment, for new businesses and new jobs. And that, in fact, is why USDA Rural Development, in addition to our existing grant, loan, and loan guarantee programs in support of renewable energy projects, has recently launched a research initiative focused on these next-generation strategic questions. And in fact, we are studying business and investment models that are designed to facilitate local investment and ownership. In addition, we're looking at logistical and regulatory questions that are affecting the rapid build-out of new energy industries throughout rural America, including but not limited to cellulosic ethanol. And finally, we are studying issues related to the integration of distributed generation, and I think this is important, of distributed generation into the existing legacy systems, in this case as it relates to electricity, but this is going to be a similar issue that has to be addressed throughout the scope of the new renewable energy opportunities. And so from that perspective, I'm gratified by BIO's contribution today. It deals with some very important questions. There are innumerable details that have to be worked out, but the bottom line in my mind is very clear. Americans' farmers can provide the feedstocks to support a growing cellulosic ethanol industry on a sustainable and environmentally sound basis. And I believe that unequivocally. This report helps make that clear, and I recommend it to your attention, and I thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Undersecretary Dorr. Our next speaker is James Huttenhouse, who is the consultant that we worked with on the report itself. Jim?
Thank you, Brent. I'm often asked, how did I get involved in this feedstock? And my answer was, I was asked by the National Renewable Energy Lab to help them lower the price of cellulose enzymes about 6 or 7 years ago. And I said, that's pretty straightforward of how to do that. It just takes a large market, a lot of full-time equivalents. I need to take in a business plan of how much money we can get back, return, from investing in improvements in cellulose enzymes. And the only thing that I could really come up with is that if you picked up 30% of the corn stalks in the U.S., you'd have the second largest enzyme market in the world. And if you could produce it for these parameters, which I thought were reasonable because I came out of that industry, you would have 70% operating margins. And as a result of that, when the request for proposal was issued by the Department of Energy to improve those cellulose enzymes, we took that story around. And as a result, we've had these advances in the biotech in improving the cellulose enzymes. Well, we still have some more work to do. And I'm going to share with you some of my perspectives on the key issues, the feedstock availability, talk about the value, an example of what we're working on in Imperial, Nebraska with my colleague Bob McGrath, and then summarize with some recommendations on how we can accelerate the commercialization of cellulosic feedstocks. Closing this gap and accelerating the commercialization requires about 5 things. Right now, every spring, a forest erupts across the Midwest. We've got all these cornfields, 10, 12 feet tall. We go in and we harvest the grain from that. And what happens to the rest of it? That other half of the crop remains there in the field. We want to be sure that we're sustainable as we remove that. But that's the other part of the crop that the farmer can not only collect, save some money by managing it differently, and produce sustainable, renewable fuels, chemicals, and materials. To do that effectively, he needs soil quality models so that he can manage his agronomic systems, his field practices, to ensure the soil carbon does not get depleted, but instead goes the other way. He's going to need some help in this transition from current practices to more no-till or less tillage. He has to make investments in new equipment, and he has new learnings. We need innovative methods, like Secretary Doerr said. We need more infrastructure. It's bulky material. We need it to improve our rail lines. We need to develop more storage practices, as shown here. We need to keep the farmer in the supply chain. And as we look at this big picture, you hear a lot about the sugar platform and the thermochemical platform to do the syngas, to produce fuels and chemicals. Well, what about this feedstock? How does this fit in? And how can we move this in the significant quantities that are required to make these major biorefineries? It doesn't really make any difference. If you go this way, you get the celluloses to come here. If you go this way, the lignin comes out. So you really need both of those processes. But more importantly, we need to be sure that in the 3 to 5 years, we have adequate feedstock supplies that the farmer can provide to reduce our dependence on those oil fields in the Middle East. We'll have our croplands, and especially the cornfields in the U.S., to feed our renewable fuels and chemicals and materials. So how much crop residue is out there? There's a lot of numbers, but here's the pie chart. And if I were going to bracket it, it's somewhere right now between 200 and 300 million tons. That's the equivalent of 15 to 30 billion gallons of ethanol that's out there right now, that the microbes are chewing that up, and most of that's going up into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide in the fields instead of being converted into fuels and coming out of the tailpipes of the cars in E85. Corn stover is certainly the largest piece of this, and corn is a wonderful crop, but there's other crops too. There's the wheat straw. There's the other small grains like barley and rice, and other crop residues like bagasse and paper mill sludge. This small piece up here is the corn fiber, another piece of the corn that's brought into the dry mills and it's into the wet mills, and that's the fiber, the outer part of the corn that people are looking at because it's already collected and already there, to looking at converting that into ethanol. So this pie is going to shift depending on the markets and the policies and the economics. And energy crops are going to come in when that market is created. Furthermore, we're closing these gaps right now due to the projects that are already being supported by the funding from the DOE and the USDA. We're improving farmer interest. This is a stale idea. People have come along every year, every couple of years. Heartland Fibers has talked about picking up corn stover and converting it into paper. That's been done in the past, but it just wasn't proven to be economic. People want to make fiber boards out of the boards that go around here, the things that go into desks, and they fail. And the farmer says, I need to see how this is going to help and move ahead. In addition to that, let me get back to the right slide here. So this one. Thank you. He needs additional information to put into that soil model, and we need the infrastructure to move this bulky material from the fields into storage places over a 2 to 3 week harvest time, and then from there, we need to deliver that throughout the year between the harvest season and the next harvest season. It has to feed the biorefinery. We need to adopt a no-till. So let's just briefly touch on the key issues. There's sustainable removal. We need a transparent, simple, low-cost validation. We need to be sure that the supply chain economics work both for the farmer and for the biorefinery and others in the supply chain. And it has to be a reliable feedstock from a supply and demand standpoint. Now, I'll say a few things more about the sustainable removal and the supply chain economics, but reliable feedstock, people understand that. The sustainable removal, all removal is local. In South Dakota, North Dakota, places where you have sandy soil or dry weather, you need to leave the material, the residues on the soil surface. You need to change the crop practice. Instead of managing this crop by plowing it under, we can remove it and eliminate the plowing, moving to no-till and installing cover crops. And all this can be achieved, but it's got to be economic, and these economics have to be proven by the farmer. And the farmer needs to use that proof to justify further investment in equipment and in learning a new system. The tillage practice is especially important for sustainable removal. When I go through the field now with a plow, I'm ripping open the surface of the soil, and that oxygen is hitting the soil carbon. Soil carbon is so important because it provides the fertility to the soil. Without good fertility, my crop yields suffer. We have more environmental runoff of nutrients. And depending on how much I plow, I'm going to lose more of the soil carbon. The greenhouse gas reduction, just taking an example of ethanol from corn stover, converting 30% of the U.S. stover, somewhere between, there's 250 to 300 million tons of stover out there, 30% of that, roughly 80 million dry tons. We can see that's offsetting the fossil fuel as E85 in cars in terms of millions of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, a measure of the greenhouse gases, between 50 and 70 million. The soil carbon change by sequestering the carbon in the soil and not plowing adds 30 to 50 million. Reducing the field operations, not having that tractor pass through the field as many times, 10 to 20 million. And then cutting back on nitrogen fertilizer. All totals up to 90 to 150 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. And that's equivalent, as the report says, as to the incremental change in greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S., from the whole economy in the U.S. in 2004. So the other key issue is the supply chain economics have to work, both to the farmer, to the biorefinery. We have to compensate the farmer for the nutrients, maintain his soil quality. His net margin per acre has to be $20 or more, or it's not worth it to him. Similarly, the value to the biorefinery, some would say it needs to be tied to the fuel price, and we're working with two projects now, one tied to the natural gas price to replace natural gas, and the other one that Iogen is in Idaho is tied to the price of a barrel of oil. And it's just not the tons, it's the composition of the feedstock that's important. For example, how much sugar am I going to get per dry ton? Because I ferment the sugar into the products. And it has to be easy to process. the amount of chemicals and the energy that are needed to process this, if I can reduce that by grinding or pre-processing up front, also improves the value. So we have a project in Imperial, Nebraska that we're following to know those values. It's a 3-year, $3+ million project. $2 million from the USDA, $1.2 million from our collaborators for the sustainable economic and farming practices. And we're validating the supply chain, and Bob McGrath from Imperial, Nebraska is going to make a few comments about that project. Now I'll move on and just show you here the map of Nebraska, where there's about 22 million dry tons that we estimate between the stover showing in orange and the yellow in wheat. And that's the equivalent of 1.5 to 2 billion gallons of ethanol from that state. That would be available now if we had the market for it and if the farmers were oriented and had established enough information to move in this direction. We've picked out this corner over here that's bordered by Colorado and by Kansas. Because of it sits on the Ogallala Aquifer, it's the driest part and minimizes the harvest risk. And Bob's going to tell you more about that project. And as we look ahead, we expect to take decisions based on the farm practices to make the investments in the equipment. One-pass harvesting that is so important because that adds up to about $40 million capital in ag machinery per year. And whether it's wet or dry storage, we show here a pile of bagasse in this corner that is used to pulp paper. And Kimberly-Clark turns that bagasse pulp into Kleenex and other wipes in Mexico and other parts of the world. And we expect to have a process validation to prove that our feedstock collection and the storage is acceptable. Here's a pile that we made last year, about 700 dry tons, 10 meters high, and it's stabilized. It's a wet pile, and we're in the process of validating it. You can see the temperatures between 70 and 110 degrees with thermocouples that are inserted in the pile. And when we sampled it earlier this year, it looked just as fresh as it was a year ago. Here's the time frame that this is not an academic process. We're putting our own money into this project, and we're in the stage gate review in the 4th quarter of this year, and we expect to have the answers to move this ahead in 1 year from now. So just to reiterate, closing the gaps to modify our farming practices for feedstock production, the no-till cover crops, the soil quality model, the assist in this no-till transition to help the farmer deal with the change in his investments and the change in his yield, the innovative methods that we want to demonstrate, and to monetize the greenhouse gas credits. So when we, in conclusion, I'd say that the ag residues, such as corn stover and straw, can supply 200 million dry tons of feedstock within the time frame that we expect these large biorefineries to be operating. And that dedicated energy crops are going to follow on to that. And to answer that question, can feedstocks both supply the world with the food, corn especially, and can they provide the biorefinery with feedstock? The answer is, Brent, definitely yes.
Thank you, Jim. And next we'll hear from Rick Tolman from the National Corn Growers.
Thank you, Brent, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the near term, and we're very excited about this report as well and the transition it gives us to the future. I'm going to answer some of your questions and some of the things that have been in the media about the short term and what's happening with corn supply and corn availability. First of all, I need my paid political announcement. Tell you I'm from the National Corn Growers. We're a federation of 46 state organizations, and we have a membership of nearly 33,000 direct dues paying members. Through our federation, we represent about 300,000 corn producers. And our mission is to create and increase opportunities for corn growers, and we feel pretty good. The past few weeks we've been creating a lot of interesting new opportunities. So I'm going to do three things. First, I want to address some of the myths and misleading information that's out there about corn and ethanol, then tell you about our vision. We call it 15 by 15 by 15, and then tell you a little bit about how we're going to get there and how this fits with the report that was released today. So first of all, a lot of myths and misinformation. First one I'm going to talk about is ethanol is causing a corn supply-demand imbalance. This is a 30-year graph showing corn supply, which is the red line. The blue line is corn use, total use, and you can see that they move in parallel. They both have been growing, and the difference in between is the stocks. Farmers respond to the marketplace, and as demand comes, they produce more product. In the last 3 years, in response to increasing demand, we've had the 3 largest crops on record. And last year, we had the 3rd largest crop, or this current year, despite drought and about 3 to 4 million acres less corn than we had in 2005. We've been producing ethanol for 20 years, and you can see that it has not created a supply-demand imbalance. And it's our contention we won't in the future either, because farmers will respond to that demand and produce more. Second myth, ethanol diverts corn away from food markets. And I want to assure you that in 2 days when you have your Thanksgiving feast, there'll be plenty of sweet corn available and creamed corn. The kind of corn we're using in ethanol is this kind of corn, which is field corn. It's dent corn. It's not the kind that you want to eat unless you have very strong teeth. They are different varieties, different production systems, different marketing systems, different economic values, and there's really no connection with sweet corn and field corn. We do use some of our field corn for human consumption, but less than 10% goes that way. It goes in corn starch, corn flour, and corn oil. In fact, when you produce ethanol, you are taking a 56-pound bushel of corn. You are extracting the starch to produce ethanol, alcohol. It's the old moonshine process. But what's left over is 18 pounds of dried distiller's grains that concentrates the protein, which is the food value, not the industrial use value. 18 pounds left over, a third, and that goes into feed markets for livestock feed, and also there is some developing for human food. So again, we're not pulling that out of the food supply. Third myth, ethanol is causing unprecedented corn prices. Well, if you go back here to 30 years again, you can see there's been a number of times. Corn prices right now at the farm gate level are approaching $3 a bushel. I think the December futures price is around $3.30. But we've been at that level multiple times in the last 20 years. And this is not unprecedented. In fact, corn prices recently have been very depressed and very low, lower than what would give a market return. And so getting back to levels that they ought to be is exactly what's going on now. If you look at the 3-year averages, you can see that over the last, there's been many times we've had a 3-year average higher than what we're going to average in the next 3 years for corn prices. Let me go back to that one just for a minute. There's a quote in the Chicago Tribune that says that using corn for ethanol will destroy our meat markets. And that quote's from 1995. And we're hearing that again. And actually, again, because these are not unprecedented prices, we are concentrated protein that goes in the livestock market, there is not a strong correlation between retail food prices or meat prices and what happens with the farm gate corn price. Another myth is ethanol takes more energy to produce than it delivers. USDA does a very comprehensive survey every 2 years. Their most recent one showed that every unit of energy invested in ethanol production returns 1.67. And I expect when they do that again in the next 2 years, that'll be closer to 2 to 1. An even more interesting ratio is this one that's up on the screen. This comes from Michigan State University. They released this a couple of months ago. It's the liquid petroleum displacement ratio. And what they're saying, what our shortage is liquid petroleum, not in coal and other forms of energy, but it's liquid petroleum. We're trying to offset our imports of liquid petroleum. Every unit of liquid petroleum invested in the ethanol process delivers 20 units of energy, and that's a very high ratio and very, very efficient. Another myth is that ethanol's displacement impact isn't significant. Yes, we're only about 4% of the total fuel supply. By the end of this year, we'll have produced 5 billion gallons of ethanol out of 140 billion gallons. But if you look at it in a little different way, between 2000 and 2006, our total fuel supply, our use of fuel, grew by 11 billion gallons. The amount of ethanol we contributed to that fuel supply was 3.4 billion gallons. So 31% of that growth in our fuel use came from ethanol. Can you imagine if we hadn't had that 3.4 billion gallons or the 5 billion gallons we're producing this year in our fuel supply, what would have happened to our gasoline prices because it's so tight? So it's adding a significant portion to our increase in use of fuels. Well, our vision is that we can reach what we call 15 by 15 by 15 billion bushel corn crop, and for perspective, we produced 10.7 this year in 2006. 15 billion gallons of ethanol, and for perspective, we'll produce 5 billion in 2006 by 2015. Now, that may sound pretty aggressive, but let me explain to you how we'll get there. In the past, our past record has been pretty good in corn production. In the past 30 years, we've increased production by 75% while decreasing acres devoted to corn. But the future is even more dramatic. This is a 30-year trend yield line, the red one. The next one coming is a 20-year yield line. The next one that's going to lay in there is a 10-year yield line. And the final one is a 5-year yield line, trend line. So my point is that our yields are increasing at an increasing rate. Every shorter period of time, we're getting increased yields at an increasing rate, and that comes from the work that's being done by the companies that Bio represents, the biotechnology groups, the things that are happening in the corn genome. We have increasing technology going into corn production, better genetics, better biotech traits, and it's increasing our productivity very dramatically. If you look at yields, if you assume just a very conservative 2 bushel per acre per yield average growth, and we've been averaging 3.5 bushel per acre, that's another 403 million gallons of ethanol every year just in yield growth. How else will we get there? Incremental acreage increase. Every additional million acres of harvested corn adds another 150 million bushels or 420 million gallons of ethanol. How else will we get there? If you look at what's happening in the biotechnology revolution in the corn area, corn is by far in the front, in the lead with technology. This is an example of the permits in the 2004-2005 crop year for things going into the pipeline. You can see how much far ahead even corn is with things in the pipeline. We have drought tolerance coming, nitrogen fixation, which will pull nitrogen out of the air and allow less nitrogen fertilizer to go down, all kinds of very exciting things in the pipeline in addition to the traits that are out there now. How else will we get there? I mentioned dried distillers grains. You process ethanol from corn. A third of this is left over. Only 2/3 is used. The starch is extracted. What's left over is called dried distillers grains, a third of the corn. By 2015, it's projected that the equivalent of 1.8 billion bushels of corn will be displaced by the dried distillers grains going back into the feed market. And that's equivalent to about 5 billion gallons of ethanol. Other things are happening. The ethanol industry is getting more and more efficient. A few years ago, we were extracting 2.5 gallons of ethanol per bushel. The average now is about 2.8. Working into new technology in the new ethanol plants, we expect to be at 3.3 by the time we get to 2015 very easily with some of the new technology in extracting the alcohol from the ethanol plant. So you put just the yield increase and the conversion rates together, we go from about 450 gallons per acre now, which is the standard now, we'll get to about 600 gallons per acre well before 2015. Another exciting thing is cellulose. We've all talked about cellulosics. When is that going to come? Well, it's here. The announcement that Broin made yesterday, the things that we've been talking about here, it's an evolutionary process. We're not going to stop processing corn into ethanol and start using switchgrass or corn stover. It's evolving. And what Broin announced yesterday that they're building is a plant that will use not only the grain, it'll use the corn stover, as well as extract the fiber from the dried distillers grains to process that into ethanol. And by the time that gets all put together, we'll be getting about 1,000 gallons per acre going from the standard we're at now, about 450 gallons per acre, when you add the cellulose coming off the corn plant that Jim talked about. So in recap, how are we going to get to that 15 billion gallons by 2015? We think it's pretty easy. Yield increase, incremental acreage shift, not significant, increased corn displacement by dried distillers grain, increased ethanol production efficiency, and being able to also add the corn stover and the fiber that could double ethanol yield per acre, go from about 450 gallons where we're at now to 1,000 gallons per acre, well within the 2015 time frame. U.S. agriculture has the capability to meet both world food supply and fuel, and make a significant contribution to our fuel needs here in the United States without challenging ourselves. We can meet our feed, food, and export markets as well as our fuel needs with what we can do. We don't think these goals are in conflict, they're incompatible. So we're excited about this report and excited about the new technology that's coming forward and all the things that are happening, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Next, we're going to hear from Bob McGrath, but I want to say that I think the American people owe the American farmer, especially the national corn growers, a debt of gratitude for getting the ethanol industry where it is today. It's been 20 years of effort, and Rick and I have talked, and the national corn growers have really been the tip of the spear to get us where we are today, and I think that's really important. Next, we're going to have Bob McGrath to talk a little bit about the Imperial, Nebraska project.
Thank you. I'm Bob McGrath, and I represent the Imperial Young Farmers and Ranchers. It's not a very big group. It's about 150 of us in a town of 2,000. But in 2004, we received a grant to study innovative methods of stover removal, potential transportation, and storage. Chase County, Nebraska grows an average of 20 to 22 million bushels of corn every year on about 145,000 acres, with a lot of other diversified crops in the county. Within the area, there are more than 2.3 million acres of cropland, and over 1 million of that's irrigated. With this background, I'll tell you where I'm coming from when I talk about our study. The Imperial Young Farmers Grant is studying 5 different things. First of all, we are going to make sure that we can continue to have sustainable agriculture. For biomass removal to be successful, it must continue to be sustainable and has to be economic to all concerned. That includes the refiners and especially the producers. It has to establish a farm value. And that is, what value will farmers release the biomass from alternate uses? In our area, it's grazing for cattle. In other areas, it's keeping additional nutrients in the soil. The potential for this is we may have to do some different farming practices, such as switching to no-till or those type of things. Another thing that is very important is you have to continue to meet all the conservation compliance provisions of the farm bills. The third thing is we want to establish innovative methods. We want to validate a wet storage. Will it work on a large scale? Will we add value to the biorefineries? That's something that we're trying to get some information from Purdue University on our pile that we did that you saw here recently. Can we move the biomass economically? Is that economically movement by truck, by rail, or by some other method? Fourth of all, we're working on a business model. For this to work, it has to benefit farmers and also the refiners. We also are going to do a life cycle analysis. This process is being constantly reviewed, and in 2005 we had a Department of Energy and USDA stage gate review. I think Jim had that slide up there. Some of the comments were, as we were doing this, is that this is very relevant to the biorefinery industry, and that we are using, when we're doing this, partners that are established in the United States and in Canada. Some of our partners we're using is Iogen, Oxbow, Purdue University, BNSF Railroad, and that this system that we're trying is applicable to our local sites. The main question is, if we don't continue sustainable processes and economic processes, this whole process may be null and void. One of the things we're doing we began in 2004, was doing soil tests. We began soil tests on 1,600 acres. We did deep soil sampling with grid tests. We used both sandy and high pH soils. Most of this ground was irrigated, center pivot irrigated. I don't know if you guys have seen that, but it's most all of our ground out there is center pivot irrigated. We looked at different rotations when we're doing these soil samplings, such as continuous corn, corn, wheat, soybean rotations, strictly corn, soybean rotations. We did partial removal of corn stover in certain parts of these grid patterns, so that we could see if there is any difference in soil fertility, those type of things. We put up a state-of-the-art weather station to see if weather makes a difference. This will be part of a long-term test. I think our grant's approximately 4 years. But for this to be sustainable, we're probably looking at a 10 to 20-year test on this. Another thing that we're trying to do right now is we're trying to develop a one-pass harvester. As they've said in a lot of places, for corn stover, the holy grail is a one-pass harvester. that allows you to take not only the corn ear, the kernels, but also the stalk and the leaves all in one pass. We do that on a small scale now with silage, but when we do that, that takes all of it, and it kind of chops up the ear, and it's not really good to separate out. To have some type of a system that's efficient, quick, and allows you to separate the corn kernels from the rest of the crop is kind of one of the things that we're also trying to do. We're working with a lot of local farmers, a lot of innovation with them, and we're working with a company called Oxbow out of New York. Hopefully, we're looking at 2007 or 2008 prototype for that. We also are working on a wet storage method. Is wet storage the best method to store biomass? We built a 600-ton pile in October of '05, so it's been there just a little over a year now. We used water to stabilize the pile and to stabilize the pH. The pile is still there out in Imperial. It's shrunk probably by 50% from where we originally is, but that's a normal type of a thing that happened. We're testing now to see if storing that for a year increased any value for any of the biorefiners. In 2007, then we're also going to work on the rail with BNSF and see if we can transport it by rail. We're working on a little bit on the business model also. That's one of the things, because if it's not cost effective, it's going to be very hard to do that. To transfer to no-till, most of our farmers say it's going to take at least $100,000. So I mean, it's a significant investment to transfer from a conventional tillage to a no-till process. If we happen to get a one-pass harvester, does that create a completely new industry? As everyone has said, if you're going to start harvesting hundreds of millions of tons of stover, that's a lot of trucks, that's a lot of equipment, that's a completely almost new industry. And why we're looking at wet storage as opposed to dry storage? It seems to be easier. There's not a fire hazard. There's less loss in a lot of cases. It takes less storage space, probably about 10% of what dry storage takes. Hopefully, there'll be some lower processing costs for the refiners. We've also looked into rail. Why would we use rail? Well, right now in most of the Midwest, the rail is the way that corn is already transported. There's a grain elevator method in a lot of areas. There's a grain elevator every 10 miles, and the rail lines run through there. So we've already got an established infrastructure there, and so in conclusion, what we hope to prove is that we can demonstrate sustainable removal. We can maintain soil quality. We can demonstrate these innovative methods do work. That we have supply higher value feedstock with a lower cost and hopefully provide some infrastructure. So I thank you, and we sure answer any questions.
Thank you, Bob.